examine, nothing too complex to analyze. The kind of questions a rabbi studied and the way he studied them often depended on his social role. Those who were deeply involved in communal administration, who sat in the councils of Poland or Lithuania, concentrated on the practical application of the law. One of the oldest and most respected scholars of this type was Mordecai Jaffe. Mordecai Jaffe was born in Bohemia and died in the year 1612. Over the course of his life, he served as rabbi in many important cities: Grodno, Lublin, Kremenets, Prague, and Posen. Toward the end of the 16th century, he presided several times over the meetings of the Council of the Four Lands. Jaffe had been a student of Moses Israel's, yet he did not accept even his teacher's work as final. He admired the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Joseph Caro, as supplemented by Israel's, but he objected to its style. The rulings were given too dogmatically, he felt, without enough explanation of how they were reached. So Mordecai Jaffe set out on a daring project. He decided to write a new, more elaborate code of Jewish law. He followed the traditional order of the 4 books of the Turim, but he called his own work the Labushim, which means the raiments or garments. The image was deliberate. Law, in his view, had to be clothed with reasoning, explanation, and intellectual fabric. In Jaffe's code, every legal rule is surrounded by discussion. He did not merely tell the reader what the law was. He showed how it grew out of the Talmud and earlier authorities. At first, this created a storm. Some rabbis feared that Jaffe's work would weaken the authority of the Shulchan Aruch. For a time, the rabbinic world was divided. In the end, however, the Shulchan Aruch held its ground and remained the central code of Jewish life. Yet Jaffe's work did not vanish. Alongside his code, he wrote 5 more volumes under the same title Labushim, including commentaries on the Bible, sermons for the synagogue, annotations to the Guide of the Perplexed by Maimonides, and even mystical speculations drawn from the Kabbalah. After Mordecai Jaffe, the leading position in the Council of the Four Lands seems to have passed to Joshua Falk Cohen. He died in the year 1616. He served first as rabbi of Lublin and later as rector of the Talmudic Academy in Lemberg. Joshua Falk Cohen became famous through his commentary on the section of the Shulchan Aruch that deals with civil law, the part known as Hosen Mishpat. He called his work Seper Ma'arif Einaim, which means a book of the enlightenment of the eyes. Its abbreviated name among scholars was Sem-A. In this book, he clarified difficult legal passages and made them usable for judges and communal leaders. At the request of the Council of the Four Lands, Joshua Falk Cohen also helped frame the Great Regulations of the year 1607, which were designed to strengthen piety, discipline, and moral conduct among the Jews of Poland. But not all great scholars followed this practical path. A more scholastic and less administrative spirit marked the work of Joshua Falk's contemporary, Meir of Lublin. Meir of Lublin was born in the year 1554 and died in the year 1616. He served as rabbi in Krakow, Lemberg, and Lublin. He delivered brilliant Talmudic lectures before large crowds. He wrote subtle, casuistic commentaries on major tractates of the Talmud. He called his main work Meir Ein HaHamim, enlightening the eyes of the wise. Scholars from all over Europe sent him questions, and his replies were collected in volumes of responsa. Rabbi Meir of Lublin prized sharp analysis above everything else. He looked down on codifiers and system builders like Israel's and Jaffe. To him, law was not a finished structure, but an endless field of intellectual combat. The minuteness of his investigations bordered on the bizarre. One famous example shows how far this could go. He wrote a special legal opinion on the question whether a woman could be considered guilty of marital infidelity if she claimed that the being who lay with her was not a man at all, but the devil, who had first appeared to her in the shape of her husband and then in the disguise of a Polish nobleman. In such questions, learned, abstract, and strange, the rabbis of Poland and Lithuania explored every shadow of the human mind and every corner of the law. And so the world of Polish Jewry lived between order and imagination, between strict codes and wild speculation, between the authority of councils and the restless brilliance of individual scholars, as the story moved forward into darker and more dangerous times. In the realm of sharp argument and intellectual fencing, Rabbi Meir of Lublin did not stand alone for long. A powerful rival soon rose to challenge him, a man whose mind moved like a blade through the dense forest of the Talmud. His name was Samuel Edels. He died in the year 1631. In the scholarly world, he was known by the shortened form of his name, but in full he was Samuel Edels, a rabbi who served successively in the cities of Posen, Lublin, and Ostrog. Samuel Edels devoted himself to the art of dialectics, the disciplined play of questions and answers, objections and solutions. The first Jewish book printed on Polish soil was the Five Books of Moses, published in Krakow in the year 1530. In the second half of the 16th century, two major printing houses, one in Krakow and one in Lublin, began to work day and night, producing a vast number of books in Hebrew and in the Jewish vernacular. They printed old Talmudic texts, new rabbinic works, sermons, and popular guides for everyday religious life. In the year 1566, King Sigismund Augustus granted a man named Benedict Levita of Krakow the exclusive right to import Jewish books into Poland from abroad. 12 years later, in the year 1578, King Stephen Batory gave another man, named Kalman, the right to print Jewish books in the city of Lublin. The reason was simple and urgent. It had become increasingly difficult to bring Jewish books into Poland from foreign lands. One of the main causes was the censorship imposed by the Roman Catholic Church in Italy. In the year 1564, the papal authorities had established strict control over the printing of the Talmud. Books were burned, passages were erased, and Jewish printers were harassed. As a result, the presses of Krakow and Lublin began to compete with the famous printing houses of Venice and Prague. Slowly, the Polish market became dominated by locally printed Jewish books. Yet for all this enormous literary energy, Jewish intellectual life in Poland remained focused almost entirely on law. Talmudic and rabbinic study consumed the best minds of the nation. There was little room left for other branches of knowledge. Among the daring men who swam in what they called the ocean of the Talmud, contending for mastery in learning and dialectical skill, only a few felt a deeper hunger for philosophy or natural science. The main exception was the group of Jewish physicians. Because of their profession, doctors had to study outside the Jewish world. They needed secular education, and that meant universities. At first, most Jewish physicians in Poland came from abroad. Some were from Spain, expelled from that country in the year 1492. Others were from Italy and had studied at the Catholic University of Padua, one of the leading medical schools of Europe. Several of these foreign Jewish doctors became personal physicians to Polish kings. Isaac of Spain served King John Albert and later King Alexander. Solomon Ashkenazi, who later became both physician and diplomat at the court of the Turkish Sultan Selim II, served King Sigismund Augustus. Solomon Kalahora served King Stephen Batory. But already in the first half of the 16th century, Polish-born Jews began to follow the same path. They traveled from Poland to Italy, especially to Padua, to study medicine. In the year 1530, for example, Moses Fischl of Krakow went there. He returned as both rabbi and physician. These journeys became more and more frequent in the second half of the 16th century. The number of Jewish students from Poland and Padua kept increasing well into the 18th century. Yet even in the world of learning, the Jews felt the weight of exclusion. The Christian Polish students in Padua refused to include their Jewish compatriots in their national register. In their own statutes, they wrote that they did not wish to mar the memory of so many celebrated men by the name of an infidel. In the official university records, the Jewish students were listed separately under the name Hebrews from Poland. Thus, even as Jewish learning flourished, even as books multiplied and academies buzzed with argument and devotion, a shadow lay over the world of Polish Jewry. It was a shadow of separation, of difference, of tension between a brilliant inner life and a hostile outer world, and this tension would soon grow darker and more dangerous as history moved forward. As religious philosophy began to fade in Western Europe during the late 16th and early 17th centuries, it never truly took deep root in the lands of Poland and Lithuania. Here, philosophy survived only as a cautious pastime, practiced timidly by a few rabbis who were already immersed in the world of Jewish law and tradition. They did not approach philosophy as a free search for truth, but as something that had to be tamed, restrained, and made safe for a community ruled by ancient authority. Two of the most respected scholars of the time, Moses Israels of Krakow and Mordecai Jaffe of Prague and later Poland, wrote explanations of the famous philosophical work called The Guide for the Perplexed, written in the 12th century by Moses ben Maimon, known in the wider world as Maimonides. This book had tried to reconcile reason with faith, logic with revelation. But the Polish rabbis handled it carefully, almost fearfully. They avoided its daring conclusions and softened its rational edge, refusing to let its bold ideas disturb the firm walls of tradition. Instead, the favorite theological book of that generation was a work called the Book of Principles, written in the early 15th century by Joseph Albo, a conservative Jewish thinker from Spain. Albo had tried to define the basic dogmas of Judaism in a way that protected belief from doubt. His work suited the mood of Poland perfectly: safe, loyal, obedient to tradition. Two major commentaries on Albo's book appeared in Poland at the end of the 16th and beginning of the 17th centuries. One was written by Jacob Koppelman of the town of Brest in Kuyaviah. In the year 1599, in the city of Krakow, he published his book under the poetic title Tent of Jacob. Koppelman loved mathematics and astronomy. He believed that geometry, the movement of the stars, and the order of nature could prove the existence of God. So he filled his religious commentary with triangles, circles, measurements, and calculations, convinced that faith could be demonstrated like a theorem. The second commentary came from Gedalia Lifshitz of the city of Lublin. In the year 1618, he published his book called The Planted Tree. Lifshitz was less interested in numbers and more drawn to metaphysics and ethics. But his understanding of philosophy was narrow. When Joseph Albo wrote that the happiness of man depends on the perfection of his thought and conduct, Lifshitz interpreted this not as moral and intellectual growth in this world, but only as preparation for the next. For him, human life had value only as a hallway leading to eternity. In this way, philosophy was reshaped to serve tradition, not to question it. In Poland, free inquiry was dangerous. Tradition ruled with iron authority. The chief rabbi of Krakow, Joel Sirkes, who lived from the late 16th century until his death in the year 1640, openly declared that philosophy was the mother of all heresies. He compared it to the seductive woman described in the book of Proverbs, the woman from whom none who enter her house ever return. According to Sirkes, anyone who fell in love with philosophy and neglected the secret mystical teachings of the Kabbalah deserved to be cast out of the community. In his eyes, such a person had no place among the faithful of Israel. Not everyone accepted this climate of fear. One of the most brilliant Jewish minds of the age, Joseph Solomon Delmedigo, traveled across Europe searching for knowledge. He was born on the island of Crete, known in Hebrew as Candia, and studied medicine, mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. Between the years 1620 and 1624, he lived for almost 4 years in Poland and Lithuania. What he saw there disturbed him deeply. With the language of the Hebrew Bible on his lips, Delmedigo cried out against the spiritual darkness he found. He said that ignorance covered the land like night. Everywhere he went, he saw schools devoted only to Talmud study, houses filled with endless argument over legal detail. But the sciences were rejected. Grammar, poetry, logic, mathematics, and astronomy were scorned. The Jews of Poland, he wrote bitterly, said that the Lord took no pleasure in the sharp arrows of the grammarians, nor in the calculations of the astronomers. Knowledge of the world was treated as a threat to the soul, While philosophy was pushed aside, another form of thought grew stronger every year: the Kabbalah. This was Jewish mysticism, a hidden doctrine about divine light, secret worlds, and the structure of creation. In Poland, it became the spiritual alternative to philosophy. It offered mystery instead of reason, symbolism instead of proof. The founder of Kabbalistic study in Poland was an Italian Jew named Mattathias della Cruda, who settled in Krakow. In the year 1594, he published a great mystical work called The Gates of Light, written in the 14th century by Joseph Gicatilla of Spain. Della Cruda did not merely print the book. He added his own long and intricate commentary, guiding Polish Jews into the labyrinth of mystical thought. Among his students was Mordecai Jaffe, the same scholar who had written legal codes. Jaffe now turned also to mysticism. He wrote a super commentary on the Bible explanation of an earlier Italian mystic named Menahem Recanati, weaving law, symbolism, and mystery together into a single fabric. In the 17th century, the old style of theoretical Kabbalah, which focused on abstract ideas about divine light, began to give way to a more practical and emotional form. This new mysticism was taught by a school that originated in the city of Safed in the land of Israel. Its great masters were Isaac Luria and his disciple Hayim Vital. They taught that human actions could repair the universe, that every prayer and commandment had cosmic power. One of the most influential followers of this school in Poland was Isaiah Horowitz. He had studied in the academies of Krakow and Limburg, and later became rabbi in the region of Volhynia from the year 1600 to 1606. Horowitz wrote a famous book of mystical ethics called The Two Tablets of the Covenant. It taught that every detail of daily life, every thought and habit, had spiritual consequences. After his death, his son, Sheftel Horowitz, who served as rabbi in the city of Posen from 1641 to 1658, published his father's work and added his own moral treatise, expanding the mystical path for a new generation. In the city of Krakow, another figure rose to fame: Nathan Spira. Born in the late 16th century, he became preacher and head of the Talmudic Academy of Krakow, serving until his death in the year 1633. Spira specialized in the new practical Kabbalah. He believed that hidden meanings lay buried inside every word of Scripture. In the year 1637, after his death, his students published his book called Revealing Deep Things. In it, he analyzed a single prayer of Moses, the moment when Moses begged God to allow him to enter the Promised Land. Nathan Spira explained this short passage in 252 different mystical ways. Each interpretation twisted letters, combined words, and drew symbolic connections that no ordinary reader could follow. According to Spira, Moses was not just asking to cross the Jordan River. He was praying about the future appearance of two messiahs, one descended from Joseph and one from David. He was trying to destroy the power of evil and atone in advance for every sin that the Jewish people would ever commit. The text became an endless maze of symbols, numbers, and hidden meanings. Nathan Spira applied to mysticism the same sharp dialectical method used in legal argument. In doing so, he created a new kind of mystical logic, dazzling in its ingenuity, but far removed from clear theology and even farther from scientific thought. Just as the scholars of law drowned in endless argument, the mystics now drowned in endless symbolism. Thus, in the cities and academies of Poland, the mind of the Jewish people stood at a crossroads. Reason was feared. Philosophy was censored. Science was rejected. In their place rose a vast and shadowy world of mystical speculation, filled with light and darkness, angels and demons, cosmic repairs and hidden sparks. And the tension between knowledge and faith, between law and mystery, continued to grow quietly, dangerously, beneath the surface of Jewish life. By the last quarter of the 16th century, the world of Polish Jewry was not only a realm of law, mysticism, and scholastic dialectics. It had also become the theater of intellectual combat with the surrounding Christian world. The religious upheavals set in motion by the Reformation had shaken Europe, giving rise to sects that rejected traditional ecclesiastical authority, questioned dogmas, and sought moral truths in new ways. Among these radical movements, the anti-Trinitarians, sometimes called Unitarians, Arians, or Socinians, stood closest in belief to Judaism. They denied the divinity of Jesus Christ and rejected the Christian doctrine of the Trinity, yet they recognized the ethical teachings contained in the Gospels. In the cities of Vilna, now known as Vilnius and Lublin, the leaders of this movement engaged fiercely with Jewish scholars, attempting to demonstrate that their faith had no roots in Judaism, even as others accused them of Judaizing tendencies. One of the most zealous of these anti-Trinitarian leaders was Martin Chekhovich of Lublin, a man of fiery conviction who relished theological disputations. He traveled from town to town, engaging both genuine Jews and those who only pretended to follow the Jewish faith, seeking to challenge what he considered errors in Jewish belief. His debates were later recorded in his books Christian Dialogues, published in the year 1575, and Catechism, published in the year 1580. These works reveal the intensity of the confrontations, the sharpness of argumentation, and the courage required of those defending Judaism in an era when religious identity could easily become a matter of life and death. In Lublin, Jacob, also known by the name Naaman of Belzhitz, took up the challenge. In the year 1581, he published a reply in the Polish language entitled Retort to the Dialogues of Chekhovich. Jacob's work defended the core principles of Judaism while highlighting the dangers posed by those who sought to incite hostility against the Jewish people. He described the disputations with vivid imagery. A Christian would pose a question based on the scriptures, and just as the Jew formulated his reasoned reply, the Christian would spring another question from a different passage. It was like a hunter's dogs pursuing a rabbit through a forest. As soon as the prey fled down one path, the hunters had to chase it down another, never allowing a moment of pause. In this way, Jewish disputants had to think quickly, respond rapidly, and sometimes interrupt their interlocutors to prevent them from escaping scrutiny, lest the arguments slip away like a rabbit into the underbrush. Chekhovich was quick to answer Jacob in print, defending his dialogues while mocking certain Jewish practices, such as the wearing of tefillin, the affixing of the mezuzah, and the ritual fringes called tzitzith. Yet, while these exchanges captured the popular imagination, they were not the final word in the defense of Judaism. A far more profound challenge to Christian theological encroachments came from Isaac ben Abraham Troki, a distinguished scholar of the Karaite Jewish movement, which rejected the authority of the Talmud and emphasized direct study of the Hebrew Bible. Troki, who died in the year 1594, was unlike other critics. He was deeply learned in both the Old Testament and Christian sources, combining legalistic precision with the sharp reasoning of a trained logician. Around the year 1593, he published his magnum opus, Hizuk Imuna, or Fortification of the Faith. In this extraordinary work, Troki not only defended Judaism against the attacks of Catholic, Lutheran, and Arian theologians, but also went on the offensive. He carefully examined the texts of the Gospels, uncovering a series of contradictions within the Synoptic Gospels, the books of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He demonstrated that the later dogmatic elaborations of the Church diverged from the teachings of the New Testament itself, and that many Christian interpretations of Old Testament prophecy were logically and historically untenable. Troki wrote with a calm authority that masked the intellectual fire of his mind, and his work became a standard of Jewish apologetic, demonstrating that reason, scholarship, and moral courage could defend the faith even in the midst of hostile scrutiny. Thus, in the late 16th century, Polish Jewry found itself at a complex intersection of knowledge, mysticism, law, and confrontation. Scholarly academies were alive with debate over the minutiae of Talmudic law and the secret wisdom of Kabbalah. Mystics traced divine sparks in every letter of the Bible. Philosophers were cautiously studied as curiosities, and Jewish apologists faced the sharpest criticisms from the surrounding Christian world. Every lecture, every disputation, every commentary carried with it the weight of life, faith, and survival. And within this world, the tension between tradition and innovation, reason and mysticism, law and the challenges of the outside world set the stage for a drama that would shape the intellectual and spiritual destiny of Polish Jewry for centuries to come. For many decades, the work of Isaac ben Abraham Troki, the remarkable Karaite scholar, remained shrouded in secrecy. No printer dared to set it in type, for the treatise Hizuk Immuna, Fortification of the Faith, was considered dangerous, a daring assault upon the very foundations of Christian dogma. It circulated only in manuscript form, painstakingly copied by hand, in the original Hebrew, and also in Spanish and German translations. Each copy was a precious treasure, a spark of intellectual resistance passed from scholar to scholar in whispered exchanges, lest it fall into the hands of those who might use it to persecute its readers. It was not until nearly a century later, in the year 1681, that the treatise saw print. The edition was produced by the German scholar Johann Jacob Wagenseil, professor of law at the University of Altdorf in Bavaria. Wagenseil, a devout Christian and a staunch defender of the Church, saw the work as a challenge to be neutralized. He included it in his anthology of anti-Christian writings, a collection given the dramatic and foreboding title Tila Igmea Satani, the fiery arrows of Satan. Wagenseil's stated purpose was explicit. The book must be placed in the hands of Christian scholars so that they could study it and refute its arguments, lest it embolden the Jewish faithful to persist in their errors. He could scarcely imagine, however, the trajectory his edition would take through the centuries. In an ironic twist of fate, Hizuk Immuna became a source of ammunition for critics of the Church far beyond the circles Wagenseil had intended. In the 18th century, the French philosopher François-Marie Arouet, better known as Voltaire, drew upon Troki's arguments, finding in them a repository of insight and critique unmatched even by the most radical opponents of organized religion in his own time. Voltaire himself marveled at the thoroughness and audacity of the Karaite scholar, remarking that not even the most determined adversaries of religion had ever advanced arguments that could not be found in the pages of Fortification of the Faith. In modern times, the work has emerged from its centuries-long shadow. Scholars have tracked down more accurate copies of the text, restoring its arguments with fidelity, and translations into multiple European languages have made the brilliance and courage of Isaac ben Abraham Troki accessible to a wider audience. The treatise, once feared and suppressed, now stands as a monument to intellectual bravery, a record of a Jewish scholar who dared to confront a dominant culture, to defend his faith with reason, historical knowledge, and unflinching moral clarity. Thus, from the cloister halls of yeshivas and the secretive scribes' chambers to the presses of Bavaria, from the disputes of Lublin to the salons of Paris, the words of Troki traveled across time and space, carrying with them the tension, drama, and relentless pursuit of truth that characterized the extraordinary intellectual life of Polish Jewry in the 16th and 17th centuries. By the year 1648, the precarious equilibrium that had allowed Polish Jewry to flourish as a compact, autonomous community for generations was shattered. The Ukraine, that southeastern borderland of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, became the crucible of calamity. Here, on the fertile but contested plains surrounding the southern basin of the Dnieper River, three hostile worlds collided: the Polish Catholic nobility, the Greek Orthodox Russian peasantry, and the Jewish lessees or stewards who acted as intermediaries. Each represented a different religion, a different social class, and a different set of loyalties, and each regarded the others with a mixture of fear, suspicion, and resentment. The Polish magnates, wealthy landlords of immense estates stretching across Kiev, Poltava, and Chernihiv, often lived far from their holdings. Their power was exercised through stewards, many of whom were Jews, entrusted with the lease of a noble's rights to collect taxes and to operate the propanation, the legally sanctioned sale of alcohol and spirituous liquors. These leases, while offering the Jews a measure of economic opportunity, also placed them in a precarious position. The Jewish arrender, as the leaseholder was called, had to maximize profits for the magnate while maintaining the appearance of authority over the serfs, the mujiks, who labored the land under oppressive conditions. The mujiks themselves, Russian peasants bound by serfdom, lived lives of hardship. Their labor was demanded not only for the regular upkeep of the estate, but also through additional taxes and obligations. Levies on mills, pastures, hives, and even the smallest tracts of arable land. Their spiritual lives were no less constrained. The Catholic clergy, supported by the Polish nobility, sought to impose church unions, forcing the Orthodox population to acknowledge the authority of the Pope and to abandon their traditional rights. To the peasants, this was not merely a religious intrusion, but an assault on their very identity. Caught in the middle of these intersecting pressures, the Jews of the Ukraine occupied a dangerous middle ground. They were the representatives of the pan, the steward, the leaseholder, the visible enforcers of the magnate's will. To the Polish Catholic, they were loyal and useful administrators. To the Orthodox Russian, they were both foreign and complicit instruments of oppression in the eyes of the downtrodden serfs. Every day, the Jewish leaseholder navigated a landscape of fear and hostility, forced to extract profits while avoiding the wrath of both the magnate and the oppressed, yet inevitably drawing resentment from one or the other. Economic tensions were compounded by deep social and religious antagonisms. The Orthodox peasants, aware of the contempt in which they were held by the nobility and the church, saw in the Jewish steward a visible symbol of their subjugation. The magnates and Catholic clergy, for their part, were often eager to assert dominance over both the peasants and the Jews, manipulating both groups to maintain control over these fertile borderlands. Every dispute over taxes, over duties, over the enforcement of religious conformity, carried the potential to ignite conflict. It was in this volatile and combustible environment that the Ukrainian Jew became a figure of constant danger, a man walking the narrow path between hammer and anvil. Between the expectations of the Polish magnate and the fury of the Orthodox peasant, between the dictates of Catholic prelates and the traditions of his own people, he lived precariously, his survival dependent on skill, cunning, and a delicate balance of power. The tension was palpable, a powder keg waiting for a spark. In the countryside, whispers of rebellion and murmurings of discontent grew louder with each passing year, as the mujik, oppressed, hungry, and desperate, prepared unconsciously for the violent upheavals that were to follow. Thus, by the middle of the 17th century, the Jews of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, once secure in their tightly knit and largely autonomous communities, found themselves on the edge of a storm that would sweep across Eastern Europe with catastrophic consequences. The Ukraine, fertile yet treacherous, became the stage on which social, national, and religious antagonisms intertwined, sowing the seeds of one of the most tragic chapters in the history of Eastern European Jewry. The spring of 1648 arrived with a bitter chill, not of weather, but of fate. King Vladislav IV still occupied the throne of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, a realm vast and diverse, yet fraught with tensions that only now began to erupt into open violence. From the town of Chigirin, in the province of Kiev, a man of resolute spirit and daring vision emerged, Bogdan Khmelnytsky, a Cossack of indomitable will. His anger at the oppressive conduct of the Polish authorities, who had long treated the local population with disdain and cruelty, became the spark that ignited a conflagration across the southeastern territories of Poland, the lands known as the Ukraina. Secretly, the Ukrainian Cossacks elected Khmelnytsky as their hetman, their military and civil leader, investing him with authority to negotiate with the independent Zaporozhian Cossacks beyond the Dnieper Falls. These Zaporozhians, a fierce, semi-military community inhabiting the steppes of what is today the southeastern regions of Ukraine, were notorious for their raids against the Turks and the Crimean Tatars. Khmelnytsky, understanding the importance of alliances, concluded a compact with the Khan of the Crimea. In this pact, the Khan promised to send a vast host of Tatar warriors to support the Cossack rebellion, a force as merciless as it was swift, drawn from the same hordes that had terrorized the Ukrainian steppes for generations. By April of 1648, The combined armies of the Ukrainian Cossacks and the Crimean Tatars crossed the borders of the Ukraine, their banners fluttering in the wind, their drums sounding the march of inevitable conflict. In the vicinity of the Yellow Waters and the town of Korsun, they encountered the Polish royal forces commanded by the generals Potocki and Kalinowski. From the 6th to the 15th of May, a series of fierce and bloody battles unfolded, culminating in a decisive victory for the Cossacks and Tatars. The Polish army was shattered, and the news of their defeat spread like wildfire across the eastern banks of the Dnieper. Emboldened by this triumph, the Russian peasants and townspeople, long oppressed under the twin yokes of Polish nobility and Jewish arendars, rose up in rebellion. Entire villages were abandoned as the peasants organized into bands of insurgents, moving with lethal speed and fury to devastate the estates of the Polish landowners. The Jewish stewards, who had managed these estates for the magnates, found themselves in the crossfire, hated as enforcers of an alien authority. Towns that had been centers of Jewish life for generations, Pereyaslav, Piryatin, Lochwitz, Lubny, and countless smaller settlements, were engulfed in slaughter. Thousands of Jews were brutally murdered, their synagogues desecrated, their homes looted, and their property destroyed. Only those who renounced their faith and embraced Greek Orthodoxy were spared the blade. In desperate measures to survive, many Jews fled to the camp of the Tatars, hoping to find a measure of protection among the very people who had been allies of the Cossacks in battle. The Tatars, notorious for their raids, were merciful in this context. They refrained from indiscriminate killing and instead took the Jews as prisoners of war. Transported to Turkey, these captives were often sold into slavery. Yet this grim fate carried with it a slender hope. Ransomed by their co-religionists from distant lands, who might save them from the cruelty of captivity. In those weeks and months, the Ukraine became a land of terror and fire. The established order, which had allowed Jews, Poles, and Orthodox Russians to coexist in a tense but manageable balance, was utterly shattered. The Jewish communities, once secure in their compact settlements and protected by local law, discovered that all their networks of influence and negotiation could not withstand the unleashed fury of the oppressed masses. The events of 1648 marked the beginning of a new and tragic chapter, an era of pogroms and massacres that would leave scars across the landscape of Eastern European Jewry for centuries to come. The Cossacks' rebellion, fueled by centuries of oppression, hatred, and the longing for autonomy, had now found its first catastrophic expression, and the Jewish population, trapped between landlords and peasant rebels, would be among the first to bear the weight of history's inexorable violence. The siege of Tulchin became a grim theater of human desperation and moral torment. The fortress walls, once symbols of security and communal strength, now trembled under the footsteps of approaching death. Inside, the air was heavy with smoke from the fires of defense, the cries of the wounded, and the unceasing tension of people who knew that their fate rested upon fragile promises and the whims of men armed with hatred and steel. The Jewish defenders, trained in the arts of both prayer and survival, manned the walls, shooting arrows and discharging their firearms against the swelling horde of Cossacks and Ukrainian peasants. Every report of gunfire was a heartbeat, every clash of steel a drumbeat, counting down the hours of life. Yet even in the midst of battle, treachery shadowed their courage. The Polish pans, who had sworn an oath to defend the fortress alongside their Jewish allies, were lured by the cunning promises of the Cossacks. Count Chetvertinsky, a magnate of considerable local influence, convened with his peers and weighed their prospects against the lives of their Jewish neighbors. Fear and self-preservation triumphed over honor. The pans, ignoring the sacred oaths they had taken, decided to hand over the Jews as a ransom, imagining that the Cossacks would then leave the Polish defenders unscathed. Inside the fortress, the Jewish leaders learned of this treachery, and a debate of conscience and courage consumed them. Rabbi Aaron, the Rosh Yeshiva of Tulchin, a man of learning, wisdom, and deep devotion to his people, spoke with a voice both calm and commanding. Let us not turn our hands against the Poles. Should we kill them, we might draw upon Jews throughout the empire the hatred of our neighbors. Let us perish honorably, as did our brethren in Nemirov. Let us not risk the lives of Jews in distant towns for the sake of vengeance or survival here. And so, with heavy hearts, the Jews of Tulchin complied with this grim counsel. They surrendered their property to Count Chetvertinsky, who, in turn, offered it to the Cossacks as a ransom for their lives. It was a futile hope, a desperate gamble, and yet it was the only measure left to the besieged. For the Cossacks, thirsting for vengeance and animated by the fires of religious, social, and national animosity, regarded the Jews not as allies or subjects of negotiation, but as enemies to be exterminated, instruments of oppression in the eyes of the peasants they had overseen for generations. Thus the fortress, a symbol of communal endurance and resistance, became a stage for the inexorable cruelty of the rebellion. The Ukrainian peasantry, inflamed by centuries of oppression under the Polish landlords and the Jewish arrenders, unleashed upon the Jewish defenders a fury that was both personal and collective. The siege of Tulchin foreshadowed the horrors that would sweep across the Ukraine over the next 2 years, an era in which towns would be emptied, synagogues set aflame, and the very identity of Jewish life in Eastern Europe imperiled by the violent clash of economic oppression, religious hatred, and the rising power of the Cossack host. Even as the sun set on the walls of Tulchin, casting long shadows over terrified men, women, and children, the story of sacrifice, betrayal, and courage was being written in blood and fire, leaving an indelible mark upon the memory of the Jewish people in the region, one that would echo through generations. The siege of Lemberg in September of the year 1648 cast a shadow over the region of Red Russia, the historical name for Galicia, which lay at the crossroads of Polish, Ukrainian, and Jewish life. The Cossack leader, Bogdan Khmelnytsky, whose fury had already left a trail of blood from the banks of the Dnieper to the villages of Volhynia and Podolia, now appeared before the walls of this ancient city. His army, bolstered by Tatar allies from the Crimean Khanate, had already shown itself ruthless and implacable. The suburbs of Lemberg, where artisans, merchants, and small farmers lived, were quickly overrun. Homes were sacked, shops looted, and those who resisted were executed without mercy. The wailing of the innocent, the cries of women and children, and the stench of smoke and blood filled the air, and the inhabitants of the city realized that they were living under the shadow of a living apocalypse. Khmelnytsky, however, was a man of strategy as well as fury. Understanding the limits of his forces against the fortified city center, he sent emissaries to the magistracy of Lemberg with a proposition. If the city surrendered its Jewish inhabitants and their property into the hands of the Cossacks, he promised that the siege would be lifted, sparing the bulk of the urban population from slaughter. The magistracy, caught between fear and law, responded with prudence. The Jews of Lemberg, though without military power to resist, were under the jurisdiction of the Polish crown, and the city authorities had no right to deliver them into the hands of the rebels. Khmelnytsky, compelled to adjust his approach, demanded instead a tremendous ransom. The Jews of the city, aware that their lives and the survival of their families depended upon meeting this demand, gathered whatever wealth they could. Merchants emptied their coffers, artisans sold their goods, and the communal funds of the synagogues were drawn upon. Contributions poured in from every quarter as the Jewish population attempted to meet the enormous demands imposed by the rebels. In this grim calculus, the Jews became, in effect, the guarantors of their own survival, negotiating with death itself through the currency of their property and collective effort. Outside the walls, Khmelnytsky's forces maintained a relentless vigilance, ready to strike at any sign of defiance. Inside the walls, the population waited, tense and fearful, aware that one misstep, one delay, could bring the slaughter of all who remained. Fathers and mothers whispered prayers over their children. Merchants clutched their ledgers and treasures, and rabbis recited psalms, exhorting the faithful to remain steadfast in their religion and hope. for the Jewish community. As for all the inhabitants of the Ukraine in those months of terror, survival was measured not only in the preservation of life, but in the endurance of faith, the safeguarding of heritage, and the maintenance of law and tradition in the face of unrelenting savagery. Even the partial success in Lemberg, the city was not taken by storm, and a massacre was averted, could not obscure the wider catastrophe unfolding across the Ukraine, Volhynia, and Podolia. Towns had been emptied, synagogues burned, and families annihilated. The wave of rebellion, once sparked, seemed unstoppable, carried on by the pent-up resentment of the Ukrainian peasants against the feudal lords and the long-standing tensions between Catholic Poles, Greek Orthodox Russians, and Jewish Arendars. Across the region, the flames of revolt and vengeance consumed centuries of coexistence, leaving behind scorched earth, shattered communities, and a memory of a terror that would be recounted in Jewish chronicles for generations to come. In the midst of this horror, the Jewish communities struggled to make sense of the destruction, to gather the surviving children and elders, and to console the grieving. Rabbis and leaders took on the roles of both shepherd and strategist, guiding their people through a labyrinth of moral dilemmas, religious obligations, and immediate dangers. Every city, every town, every village became a scene of tension, courage, and tragedy, a microcosm of the broader catastrophe that had engulfed Eastern Europe in the mid-17th century. The summer of 1655 brought yet another chapter of despair and terror to the Jews of White Russia. Fleeing the walls of Mogilev on the Dnieper with their families, their possessions, and the hope of survival clutched tightly in trembling hands, they believed for a moment that the mercy of law, or at least the mercy of retreating Polish forces, would spare them. But the promise of Colonel Poklonsky, the Russian officer commanding the garrison, proved to be a treacherous trap. As the Jewish exiles moved along the roads, carrying children on their shoulders and bundles of household goods, the soldiers turned upon them with an iron-hearted cruelty. Men, women, and children were struck down without hesitation. Property was plundered, and the cries of the dying rose over the fields, mingling with the screams of animals driven from nearby farms. The Jewish communities of Mogilev, which had survived the horrors of Cossack uprisings only to be displaced and massacred, were effectively wiped out in a single, merciless stroke. The cruelty of these events was amplified by the confusion of war and the shifting allegiances of the region. The Muscovite forces, following orders from Tsar Alexis Mikhailovich, had seen themselves as liberators of the Greek Orthodox population, yet for the Jewish minority, their arrival was nothing less than a death sentence. The Jews were doubly trapped by their own Polish nationality, which marked them as outsiders to the Russian authorities, and by their faith, which distinguished them from both Polish Catholics and Russian Orthodox Christians. In these years, the Jewish people of Eastern Europe were at the mercy of contending powers whose ambitions left no room for mercy, reason, or restraint. At the same time, the Swedish army under King Charles X Gustav, moving through the territories of Poland in the years 1655 to 1658, added another layer of destruction. Known in history as the Deluge, this Swedish invasion coincided with the chaos wrought by Khmelnytsky's Cossacks and the Muscovite army. Cities were occupied, forts stormed, and the civilian populations caught between these forces endured widespread plunder. For the Jewish communities, already decimated by previous uprisings and massacres, the Swedish advance meant further pillage, forced displacement, and intermittent massacres. Synagogues were destroyed, libraries burned, and communal treasuries looted. Amid this unrelenting turmoil, the Jews clung to their religious institutions and communal structures, which alone provided a semblance of continuity and moral support. The councils of the Four Lands, the autonomous governing body of Polish Jewry, attempted to maintain some order, issuing decrees and communal regulations even as entire regions descended into chaos. Through these years, the pattern became tragically familiar. Rebellion, invasion, and massacre alternated with brief periods of relief and restoration. Each time, Jewish communities struggled to recover, to rebuild homes, re-establish markets, reopen schools, and resume worship. Yet the scars of trauma ran deep. The memories of those brutally slaughtered, the destruction of property and sacred spaces, and the constant knowledge that any future outbreak of violence could strike at any moment. The Ukraine, Volhynia, Podolia, White Russia, and Lithuania became a landscape marked by cycles of terror and survival, a proving ground of faith and endurance for the Jewish people of Eastern Europe. Even as the armies of the Swedish king and the Muscovites are moved on, leaving towns and villages in ruin, the Jewish communities began once more to collect the survivors, bury the dead, and record in chronicles the horrors they had endured. Each account of massacre, each chronicle of martyrdom, was a testament to human suffering and resilience, and a warning for generations yet unborn. The words of the rabbis, the records of communal councils, and the dirges sung in the synagogues became, in a sense, the only bulwark against complete cultural annihilation, a fragile chain linking the survivors to the memory of their lost brethren. The years 1654 to 1658 thus stand as one of the darkest chapters in the history of the Jews of Eastern Europe. The interplay of Cossack rebellion, Muscovite ambition, and Swedish invasion created a maelstrom of violence and terror, within which Jewish communities were both witnesses and victims. Yet even in these days of despair, the people strove to maintain their faith, to preserve their traditions, and to find meaning in suffering, a thread of spiritual resistance that would endure even as the political and military tides swept away homes, synagogues, and lives. The years of 1654 to 1658 were thus marked by a maelstrom of violence, in which the Jews of Poland and its borderlands were caught in an unrelenting vice between invading armies and domestic fury. In Vitebsk, a city on the Dubnow River in present-day Belarus, the Jewish inhabitants showed remarkable courage, throwing themselves into the defense of their town. They dug deep trenches around the fortified castle, strengthened the walls with hastily erected barricades, and supplied soldiers with ammunition, powder, and horses. Acting as scouts, messengers, and laborers, they risked their lives daily to resist the besieging Muscovite army. Yet, when the city finally fell into the hands of the invaders, the Jews were left utterly defenseless. The Zaporozhian Cossacks, savage and merciless, looted their homes, burned their stores, and carried many away as prisoners, while others were forcibly baptized or sent into exile to distant cities such as Pskov, Novgorod, and Kazan in the northern reaches of Russia, far from the familiar lands of their birth. In Vilna, the capital of Lithuania, the fate of the Jews was similarly tragic. The city had fallen under the occupation of the combined Muscovite and Cossack forces in August 1655. A significant portion of the Jewish population fled for their lives, while those who remained faced immediate death or expulsion by the decree of Tsar Alexis Mikhailovich, who sought to placate the local Russian townspeople. These townspeople, in their desire to rid themselves of economic competitors, welcomed the destruction of Jewish homes and the removal of Jewish merchants, artisans, and scholars. Meanwhile, the Polish heartlands along the Vistula and San rivers, which had previously escaped the horrors of rebellion and foreign invasion, were now engulfed in chaos by the Swedish forces of King Charles Gustav. The invasion, known in history as the Deluge, from 1655 to 1658, brought bloodshed and terror to the very center of the Polish realm. Cities like Krakow and Warsaw surrendered with alarming ease, leaving vast stretches of Great and Little Poland under Swedish control. King John Casimir, forced to abandon his throne and flee to Silesia, watched helplessly as his kingdom seemed to crumble beneath him. The rapid Swedish victories were compounded by internal decay. The anarchy and political demoralization that had taken root in Poland, coupled with treachery from former officials like the sub-chancellor Radzievsky, allowed the Swedes to occupy key cities without significant resistance. Many Polish nobles, the Szlachta, fearing the chaos and hoping to preserve their estates, capitulated to the northern invaders. Protestant and Calvinist factions within Poland welcomed the Swedish army, viewing them as liberators against Catholic domination, much in the way that the Cossacks looked to Orthodox Russia for salvation. The Jews, however, had no political advantage to gain from treachery. Their loyalty, or their mere survival, did not align them with the Swedish army, and unlike the Polish Protestants, they were not viewed as potential allies. This steadfast neutrality, or lack of political partisanship, came at a terrible price. They were, as contemporary chroniclers observed, like a man fleeing a lion only to be met by a bear. The Jews, spared by the Swedes, now found themselves prey to Polish irregulars, organized in 1656 under General Charnecki, who were intent on expelling the Swedish forces from the homeland. These so-called patriots, in their zeal to reclaim Polish cities, unleashed upon the Jewish population a cruelty that rivaled anything committed by Khmelnytsky's Cossacks in the Ukraine. The massacres in Great and Little Poland were conducted with ruthless efficiency. Nearly all Jewish communities in the provinces of Posen, Kalisz, Krakow, and Piotrków were destroyed. Rabbis were killed, women violated, and men slaughtered by the hundreds. Only those who were willing to convert to Catholicism were spared. Chroniclers of the time, recording the deeds of the brutal Charnecki and his followers, described atrocities so shocking that they seemed to surpass even the horrors of the Ukraine 8 years prior. The Polish irregulars had, it seemed, learned the grim techniques of annihilation from their Cossack counterparts, applying them with a methodical cruelty in the wake of the retreating Swedish forces. Chapter 5. While the Polish forces carried out their vengeance in western Poland, the Muscovites and Cossacks continued their campaigns of destruction in the eastern provinces and in Lithuania. Cities burned, towns were pillaged, and Jewish communities suffered repeated displacement, torture, and slaughter. Not until 1658, after a prolonged series of battles, negotiations, and treaties with Sweden and Muscovy, did the cycle of violence begin to ease. Even then, the restoration of political order came at a heavy cost, with territories ceded, populations displaced, and the social fabric of Poland severely weakened. Throughout these tumultuous years, Jewish communities demonstrated remarkable resilience. Even amidst destruction, they maintained their spiritual and communal life, burying their dead according to tradition, recording massacres in chronicles, and preserving the teachings of their rabbis. The councils of the Four Lands, despite the chaos, issued decrees and organized relief to re-establish some semblance of governance. Each victory and each setback, each massacre and each miraculous survival, became part of the collective memory of Eastern European Jewry, engraved into the very consciousness of the people who endured these relentless storms of war, treachery, and persecution. The years 1654 to 1658, then, were an epoch in which the Jewish population of Poland and its borderlands experienced the full force of geopolitical catastrophe. Cossack rebellion, Muscovite conquest, Swedish invasion, and Polish internal conflict converged to produce a human tragedy of immense scale. And yet, even in the face of almost unimaginable suffering, the Jews held fast to their faith, their communities, and their hope, laying the foundations for survival in the turbulent centuries to come. The losses suffered by the Jews of Poland during the fatal decade, spanning 1648 to 1658, were almost beyond comprehension. Chroniclers of the time give staggering numbers. Between 100,000 and 500,000 Jewish men, women, and children perished. Even if one accepts the lower estimate, the scale of the catastrophe exceeds the horrors of the Crusades that swept across Europe in the 12th and 13th centuries, and even the Black Death that decimated Western Europe in the mid-14th century. Entire communities were obliterated. Some 700 Jewish settlements across Poland were destroyed, their synagogues burned, their homes pillaged, their scholars slain. In the Ukrainian cities along the left bank of the Dnieper River, the region dominated by Cossack forces and corresponding to the present-day governments of Chernihiv, Poltava, and parts of Kiev, the Jewish population had almost entirely vanished. On the right bank of the Dnieper, in Polish-controlled Ukraine, and in the provinces of Volhynia and Podolia, wherever the Cossacks had passed, only about 1/10 of the Jewish population remained. The survivors had either escaped the bloodshed by fleeing westward into Lithuania, the central provinces of Poland, or Western Europe, or had been carried away by Crimean Tatar raiders into the Ottoman Empire, where they were sold as slaves. Many were eventually